Yay, all the faces, all the
Oh,
tiles. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
oh,
All right. I love it. It's a really motley crew today that we have of lead fellows former, lead fellows present. We have some of our climate entrepreneur fellows here as well. And of course, we have our guest of honor, Ashley, who I'll introduce in just a sec. Awesome. Annalika, I love the blonde. Looks awesome. Hi, Sally. Gitanjali. Great. All right. And I should have known Ashley has an amazing background. So I know we have a tight hour today. Ashley has to leave right at the hour, and she's prepped an amazing presentation for us. So I thought we could get started right away with, first of all, introducing who our amazing guest of honor is, Ashley Alvarado, the Director of Community Engagement at KPCC and the LAist. It's funny, we asked around at Solutions Journalism Network, like, who are the best people in our network to talk about engagement, who's helped us think differently about engagement? And 100% of people said Ashley. It's true. And you have our claim to fame because I think you laminated the 22 questions to complicate the narrative, which is like next level dedication. Bring out the lamination machine. There are so many wonderful things to say about you, but I'm really, really excited for you to speak with us a little bit today about, the successes you've seen with engagement, and then give this amazing panel of entrepreneurs from all around the world an opportunity to ask you some questions about how they can strengthen those elements of their project. So without further ado, Ashley, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you so much. I am going to attempt to share my screen, which is always that reminder that I have way too many apps open. Can everybody see that? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
The slide preview thing.
Are you seeing the presenter view?
Yeah.
Okay, that's so funny because before, oops, let me do it again. Try one more time. The last time I did this, that was my big revelation that I could do it without the presenter view showing up. But apparently it's not 100% of the time. So thank you.
No problem.
As Joel said, my name is Ashley. My pronouns are she, her, and I am always happy to stay in touch. So please feel free to tweet me, to email me. I can tell you, and Jules can tell you, I might not always be the fastest at responding to email, but I will do it. I love a to-do list. So everything gets in there and I will answer and happily stay in touch. Because we are so tight for time, I will probably go kind of quickly. I am the mother of a first grader. At any point, if you want to do a shouty outy, if you want to unmute and say, hey, Ashley, slow down, or can you tell me more about this? I'm perfectly happy to do that. I can't see everybody's faces. Oh, you can see a hand behind me though. He's really into making webinar cameos. But yeah, so I can't see everybody's faces in the chat or the chat. But I am always happy to stop what I'm doing and to talk with folks. Before we get into it though, one of the things that I wanted to do was to just let you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about engagement. So the things that I think about, it's not a concise definition. I have one of those on the next slide. But for me, engagement and engaged journalism is about closing the gaps between communities and the journalists who are aiming to serve them. It's thinking about serving those who might not already be consuming your journalism. and with that, you're thinking about story selection, framing, language, and distribution. Something I'm hearing more and more from newsrooms is we changed. Sorry, what, buddy? Okay, ask Papa to help you because Mommy's on a call. Parenting is very real. But the thing I was going to say is that more and more I'm hearing from newsrooms, well, we changed this thing, but audiences didn't come. And it's this recognition that if you're trying to reach audiences that you haven't traditionally served or served well, then you need to make sure that you're not only changing or adjusting your content, but also making sure that you're doing the work to go to audiences and not expecting them to come to you. And then, of course, it's thinking about how we can shape stories and content with community members. I love Lindsay Green Barber's definition of engagement too. I think it's pretty straightforward, and it's something that's maybe a little bit easier to wrap your head around. And that's thinking about journalism that's an inclusive practice, prioritizing the information needs and wants of community members it serves. Something that I think is really valuable, again, is saying, you're not just working on maybe doing something that's a collaborative effort. You're not just doing something that demonstrates that you're listening, but you're also creating a welcoming space with your work. I was just in a conversation, speaking very candidly, because one of our hosts at our radio station, KPCC, this morning wished people a happy Cinco de Mayo. As somebody who spends a lot of time explaining that Cinco de Mayo is most often not what you think it is, that was one of those moments of going, hey, let's have a conversation about this, because this thing that you thought was just a nice way to start the morning may actually not feel like you're creating an inclusive space for audiences and for colleagues. So for those, one of the reasons it's always so important to talk about how I define or how we define community engagement is because this isn't a practice that's been around for all that long. At the same time, I will say, especially if you look at community, ethnic, and language media, people have been doing this. I think in some ways, and you see on the far left, an article that Joy Mayer did as part of her research about 11 years ago, kind of getting at what does engagement mean. This is something that is in so many ways new school only because of how old school it is. It's understanding that as content creators, that it's our responsibility to listen and to distribute and to just do everything we can to close those gaps. So engagement was kind of going along. It was building up momentum. In 2015, Journalism That Matters, which is a nonprofit I chair, and the Agora Journalism Center came together to host Experience Engagement, which is one of the first convenings focused on engaged journalism. And that was really powerful, maybe more than anything, because a lot of us who were, and it's still true, so often the only person in an organization doing this work was for the first time able to see the community of practice that was coming together. We came back together in 2017, and that helped spark the launch of Gather, which is a community of practice for engagement practitioners. Then in 2019, the Online News Association, which I'm really excited to now be on the board for, was the first major organization. This is one of those things that didn't start out with like a lot of conflicts of interest, but now I feel I have to qualify every statement. But in 2019, ONA launched the first ever Engaged Journalism Award from a major organization. And I'm so proud to say that my organization has won that the primary award the last 2 years. And just so you know, the entry period for it started today. So if any of you have things that you want to enter, it's a good time to think about it. Okay, so why engagement? And there are a lot of different reasons to think about it. One of the things that I am really thrilled about, can you hold on for 1 second? I'm so sorry. I think my son just fell down the stairs. Be right back.
No worries. No worries. Yes, this is an awesome time to pause and, just once again celebrate some of the many people who are here today. We have, of course, our 2021 lead fellows, our 2020 lead fellows, and some of our folks leading climate entrepreneur efforts too. So hopefully when you're scrolling through the videos, you can see who's who. Everything okay, Ashley?
Yes, he's very, very much a first grader.
We love that.
I also realized that I hit pause share, which does nothing to quiet the potential screaming that you may hear. But anyway, I had one conference I did last year where he also fell down the stairs at the beginning of it. So like they're introducing all the panelists and you just see me running out of the room. Okay, so one of the things that I am really thrilled to see is that it's gone from a time when you had a lot of newsroom leaders saying, well, tell me why we should care about engagement, to more and more newsroom leaders saying, okay, we get this is important. We don't know how to do it. And that's a neat point because this is where you're going to see a lot of creativity. You're going to see a lot of innovation. But I don't want to leave behind the opportunity to talk about some of the reasons you should be, organizations should be thinking about engagement. One is trust. We cannot and should not assume that we have audiences trust. There are great organizations, though, that can support organizations to get tools to build trust. I point to solutions journalism all the time and complicating the narrative. That's something that happens not only in the final product, but that you see it as you're communicating with sources. I was working with, as an example, a fellow with the California Health Journalism Program last year, and she was interviewing folks who had generational addiction, and really thinking about how do I make sure that in the process of interviewing folks, I'm building that trust and I'm not being tempted into anything that could be exploiting their experiences. And so we really said, okay, well, how do you make sure that you're looping? How do you make sure that you're thinking about saying things back so that you can make sure you're on the right path? One of the reasons that when I first was introduced to Complicating the Narrative, I loved it so much is I very clearly remember a conversation I had with a source, gosh, like 10 years ago. And she was saying, you know, I was interviewed. I never heard anything back from the reporter. And then my cousin called me because she saw my picture on the front page of the newspaper with just the words, "The new face of poverty." And that is in no way how I see myself. That is not my identity. And it was crushing for her. And so, you know, you think about how do we do great journalism without doing those acts of journalism that so many communities have experienced over time. Engagement's also a really fantastic way to find new sources, to build relationships. It's a way to improve your reach. When we started tagging our stories in our content management system so that we could see the performance of stories that were done through engagement versus those that weren't, we actually saw that those stories were reaching more audiences, that they were bringing people back in a way that other stories weren't, and that people were spending more time on them. You know, something that I often go back to is like the party pictures in magazines. You want to pick them up because you want to see yourself reflected in them. So think about just how much more powerful that is when this is meaningful information. We want to be relevant. You know, again, I go back to that conversation that I've heard of saying, like, well, we've changed what we've done, but it's just not finding an audience. You know, we'll make sure that you're building something that people want and need. There's a great, if inaccurate, quote from Albert Einstein that says, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend the first 55 minutes identifying what the problem is. Like what if we spend time really looking to understand information needs and habits before we build a product? Story ideas. When we're not listening, we're leaving stories on the table. There are, and you'll see a picture of it, there's a sourcing conversation series that I run. And one of the things that we used to hear over and over again would, you know, there are these, they're called feeding the conversation, because one of the things that we do a lot of in engagement is feed people. And it's really about having 4 or 5 people at a table with one to 2 of our journalists, and they have different prompts, and the journalists kind of get to experience discovery. And at almost every one of these, you'll hear a reporter or producer say, wow, this is so interesting. Why aren't we talking about this? Why haven't we heard a story about this? And then you'll hear a community member say, Well, we're talking about it all the time. You just don't hear it in the news. And so thinking about how do we get to some of those ideas so that we're producing unique and more original content. And then the bottom line, again, there is mounting evidence that shows that if we're trying to, I don't know, I might be off on it, but my understanding is that the membership journey in public radio, as an example, is 8 years from discovery to donation. And what we have found with some of our work, again, when we're tracking it, is that we can get that down to months. We can accelerate the relationship so that more people are giving. It's also something where increasingly, especially as foundations are looking to trust, to equity, to serving diverse audiences, that this is an important mechanism for doing it. Again, I see a number, a notification with the chat. I don't see the chat, so at any point, feel free to voice any of the questions folks might have. One of the things that that I'm always saying, and I think it's really important, especially when you're looking at newsrooms, is where does the engagement person or the engagement team live? Something that I'm really proud of is that in our organization, it lives in content. I report directly to our chief content officer. And as part of the content leadership team, we're able to signal to the rest of our newsroom and to the communities that we're serving just how much weight we put behind this work. And it is work. Some of the things that I like to talk about with this is the importance of bringing empathy into engagement. And I'm really specific when I'm talking about the definition of engagement. Of empathy. And that's the definition that's used in design thinking. It's a willingness to have your assumptions challenged. I heard an unmuting. Not intentional? Okay. So, and the reason that I bring that up is so often in traditional interviews, we're talking about getting that soundbite we need, getting the precise answer to the precise question that we have. But through engagement, we're preparing ourselves to be surprised and developing the kind of agility that we need to respond to that surprise in real time. It's relationship building. So it's thinking about how do we move from the transactional or the extractive practices that again are so often associated with journalism to thinking about how can we be in relationship. One of the things, having also judged the Gather Awards for the Online Journalism Awards related to engagement, it's going beyond the call outs to thinking about how can we make sure that we're also in service to communities. And then resilience. This is true of engagement work. This is really true as newsrooms are trying to address issues of racial justice and equity, and understanding that unsafe and uncomfortable are not the same thing. If you're really digging into this work, there are times that you are going to be uncomfortable. At the same time, it is critical that you identify when that's moving into being unsafe, but also to recognize that discomfort is not most of the time the same thing as being unsafe. I was part of an event that frankly went really, really wrong. And a colleague of mine said at that point, he said, I felt unsafe. And I asked him, I said, did you feel unsafe or did you feel uncomfortable? And he reflected for a second. He said, you know what? He goes, I felt uncomfortable. And I valued that moment so much because he also was there with me. As I said, what you felt for those, for those few hours that we were together is what most of the rest of us feel every day. And he was like, oh, and he got it. And we were able to move through and do some pretty incredible work because we had that shared understanding. Right sort of along with that is the understanding that as we're doing this work as journalists, we never start with a blank slate. There's a lot of training. I feel like everybody is doing DEI training right now of some shape, but you might hear about the soda rule or the pop rule. I can't remember which one it's called. I'm from Oregon, so I call it pop. Or the idea of a million cuts, but just understanding that people are coming into every interaction with a lifetime of experiences. And so if you make a misstep, the way that it's experienced may not be as that individual misstep or that, or again, thinking about that happy Cinco de Mayo comment today, that for me is something that cuts deep because I spend so much time talking, with folks about saying like, let's let's understand this. Let's think about this. And then one thing, you know, as I move into some resources and some examples, is just noting that even though I feel like I've been in this work forever, it's still fairly new, especially as the definition's still coming together. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's still a profession that is yet to be professionalized. Okay, so this is probably like the helpful part, I hope. And that's some resources and inspiration. You'll see that solutions journalism is on this list, but these are some of the links that I share with folks as they're getting started. The American Press Institute, which has done a lot of support of community listening, has a website called betternews.org. And Jules has the PDF for this in case anybody just wants to see the deck itself. Apparently I created a ginormous file, and so I couldn't share any other way other than PDF. But yeah, so Better News has a lot of case studies looking at work that folks are doing across the industry. City Bureau is just this groundbreaking organization that's done really meaningful work in Chicago and Detroit, and they're very generous in their learnings. I should also do a plug. I think it's May 11th that Current is hosting a conversation. A colleague of mine, Mariana Dale, is hosting it with Daryl Holiday, who's one of the co-founders of City Bureau. And both of them are just incredibly smart humans, and so I highly recommend it. Gather, which I've mentioned before, the website's letsgather.in, and there you can find case studies that are really specific to engaged journalism. But even better than that is the Slack workspace. If you're wanting to learn more about engagement, whatever sort of like your path into it is, what you'll find in that workspace is a collection of folks who are really sort of living what they do, and are always very, very generous to offer advice, help with a connection, weigh in on something that you're doing. Journalism That Matters is the nonprofit I mentioned before that I chair. And what we really focus on is how we can catalyze communities and journalists to work together through meaningful engagement. And so it's a lot of learning by doing. And so, you know, if there's anything, again, whether it's through Journalism Matters or just by messaging me, I'm always happy to be helpful. Open News is just another incredible organization. It really spearheaded the work behind the new DEI coalition for just and anti-racist newsrooms, another really great Slack workspace. And if you're wanting to continue learning, and just by all of you being lead fellows, I think you are, Open News does a lot of scholarships to participate in its programs, but also this year created a scholarship for you to just learn. They're just giving you money to go out and learn something new. And it's one of those organizations that is extremely principled and demonstrates that every day. And then I think you all, Solution Set is another really great way to get, so they have a newsletter from LinFest. And again, it's a way to kind of dig into different projects. And then what I was going to say is, I think you all have heard of solutions journalism, so I won't go too deep into that, but just know that this is a really inspirational organization making meaningful work happen. This is a Medium page that my team oversees, and it's where we share what we have been doing, how, you know, what we're learning about. We recently did a post on just how unglamorous this work is. Part of the confession, or that started it, was my telling folks that I bought my car because it had a big trunk low to the ground and it made it easier for me to haul things around. You know, we talk about all the things that come with the work that maybe people don't get to see so often. And then coming up pretty soon, we have a post from our managing editor who really became a believer in engaged journalism, and a post by one of our reporters who's been distributing ozone seeds across Los Angeles. Okay, so here's a look at some of the work we're doing. when I mentioned, talking about relevance and or at least thinking about it, one of the ways that we've gotten into this is by turning to human-centered design, which is a research methodology that asks us to examine the problem before we start designing solutions. We started this work and we've been able to partner with an incredible woman named Tran Ha, who's based out of Chicago, but has also been involved in the design school at Stanford. And is one of the folks who runs the Women's Leadership Accelerator through ONA. But we started this effort a number of years ago when we were wanting to redesign our early childhood beat. And the work there was so transformative for us that we've again gone back to the same approach to design our census coverage, to develop a brand new beat looking at the pathway to higher education. And then we'll soon be going back to that to design another new beat for us. One thing that I want to make sure to point out is that when we went into the early childhood work, our chief content officer is the first person to tell you that she always has a bias toward technology. She was convinced we're going to do this research and that coming out of it, we would develop a Yelp for preschools because we wanted to figure out how to super serve parents and caregivers of children 0 to 5 in LA County. What we've discovered, though, is that the real need that was felt across these different stakeholder groups wasn't for high tech, it instead was for high touch. And so coming out of that, we were able to create a position for our first ever beat specific engagement producer to really invest in SMS, so text messaging, and then to spend a lot more time just being in person, which has been just really, really meaningful. Mission statements. Adolfo Guzman Lopez is just one of my favorite people, especially in public radio. And I need to update this slide because we recently debuted a new version of these. But what we did, and you can see it if you go to laist.com/staff, is that we really wanted to be public facing and having each reporter name his or her or their mission statement. What's their framework? How do they think about the work that they're doing? And to just be more human. I was able to share my next thing at 10 is that I'm a table stakes coach. But I was able to share with some of the newsrooms participating in table stakes yesterday what these staff bio pages look like now, because it takes somebody whose voice you might recognize and whose byline you might recognize and really brings in the whole person. So you're seeing, what do they love about their jobs? What are they doing? There's a fantastic bio from Emily Elena Dugdale, who looks at criminal justice, and she's saying, like, if I'm doing my job right, you are seeing, you're seeing how problematic the system has been. And that's important because we're naming the foundational truths that inform our work. And we're just, and then we also have these embeds on every page so that people can connect directly with reporters, ask them questions, and name the information needs that they have. If you are somebody who's trying to make the case in your organization, one thing I'll also point out is that more than 50% of people who ask us questions sign up for our newsletters. Email acquisition is one of the things that folks care about, rightly so, care about the most right now. And so this is a great way to show that you can do that. Direct mail distribution. When I talk about going old school, I'm talking about going all the way to the USPS. We have found, and actually this, trying to think whether this one was too, the first time we went back to doing direct mail distribution was in part because of a grant that we had from Solutions Journalism, and it was funding the reporting of Priska Neely, our former early childhood reporter who was focused on disparities when it comes to infant mortality. And what we wanted to do, we're in a county that is 8% Black. Our listenership tends to hover around 7 or 8% Black. And we were trying to engage with Black women in their early childbearing years in order to be able to come in at an intervention point and talk about the realities of Black infant mortality due to racism. And it's not racial differences, it's racism in LA County. So across the country, Black babies are twice as likely to die before their first birthday than white babies. In LA County, they're 3 times as likely to die. And so we really wanted to have conversations. We had done this, she had done all this incredible reporting, a lot of really incredible engagement. And we were looking to do a capstone event. My colleague who runs the events team had said, if we're able to bring together 50 people, that'll be a win, because this is a community that we haven't done a great job of serving. And I said, well, I'd really like to target having 100 people leveraging direct mail, leveraging other kinds of engagement. And we were able to identify zip codes with higher incidence of infant mortality, and then also use the data that's stored within the Postal Service's everyday direct mail, door direct mail website, as far as the demographics of different zip codes and postal tracts, and to send these postcards out. Well, we actually, we sold out the event, and it was like a rainy Thursday in LA. So all of those things typically contribute to nobody coming out at all. We actually had so many people that we had to open an overflow area. And then the demand was so high that we did a follow-up event that was entirely engagement driven.
Yeah,
Bernardo, I
actually,
see you unmuting.
yes. Thank you. I just have a practical question about that. I love this approach. And but how about costs? Meaning, how many people you actually reached with this approach with postcards, and how much would that cost to the news organization?
So direct mail distribution typically has around a 5% conversion rate when it comes from, getting activity from reading onto a website. We saw about 5.5%, so it was a really good turnaround. What you see on your screen and the one we did for Black infant mortality, I designed those in Canva, so the designing was entirely free. Between printing and shipping 6,000 of them, I think it came out to about $1,200. One of the things, that we were really mindful of, I often say that project and parachute aren't that different as words or approaches, because so often if you have an initiative, you decide this is a target audience we want to serve with this targeted content, you do all the work to cultivate them, and then you peace out. And so what we wanted to make sure that we were doing is we're saying, like, listen, we know that we haven't been a reliable source of relevant information. And so we wanted to make sure that we were building in communication mechanisms as we did that. And so we actually, based on that particular work, launched a weekly texting service. And we have nearly 100% retention 2 years later. So as far to your question, I think that the return on that investment has been really, really high for us. I would also say, depending on the work you're doing, that is kind of in the sweet spot for foundations to give you the to help cover those costs. We also love on-site tabling. Again, so much of engagement is just thinking about how do you get into the physical spaces, digital spaces, and language of the communities that you're trying to serve. This picture is from another horrible day, but we were looking to connect with potential voters across Southern California. And so we went to Santa Clarita at a swap meet, which is our signal is terrible there as a radio station. We also, we met with a lot of people who either didn't know who we were or didn't like who we were, and had some pretty big assumptions about us. And so we spent a lot of time just listening, introducing ourselves, and being there. The reason I say it was a horrible day is that, for those of you who know Santa Clarita, it's really windy, and our tent flew off and hit somebody in the head. And I was convinced that day was going to be the end of our entire organization, because we were going to lose a lawsuit and just go out of business. Fortunately, that did not happen. Feeding the conversation, I mentioned this before. This is one of those ways that we're making sure that we are holding space for folks to share, but also making sure that we're building both an approach called appreciative inquiry, that thinks about how we can ask more generative questions into it, and demonstrating our appreciation. So many of the folks that we have met through these convenings have continued to be really valuable sources for us. At the head of the table there is a comedian and performance artist, Christina Wong, who, she's been featured on our website. She's participated in a storytelling series that we do. She's been on panels, and she is just, she's just a gem of a human being. What's funny is that I also had been putting together a report or a deck or something when we hired our first beat specific engagement producer. And that's when I discovered that I had actually first met her when she attended one of these Feeding the Conversations. And so she got to experience the way that we do engagement before she started doing it herself. Asking questions. I mentioned that engagement could and should go beyond the call outs. It doesn't mean that you need to walk entirely away from doing call outs. And so it's really thinking about how do we make sure that we're asking questions, but with that willingness or eagerness to have your assumptions challenged. If we hired earlier this year, a former arts education reporter from our team, from our organization, became our first ever engagement reporter. So really somebody who's dedicated to tracking down the answers to questions that folks have, or demonstrating what inclusive reporting looks like. And something that I love is that whenever she tweets out one of the questions that she's asking, she also tells people how she's using the information, what she's planning to do with it. And so it's not somebody coming in asking you this really personal question and then never responding to you. So often people pour their hearts out and then they don't get a confirmation email that you received it. So it's thinking about things like that. Answering questions. So just in 2020, my team answered more than 6,200 questions personally. Most of them were COVID related. We actually completely overhauled how our team works in starting in March of last year in order to facilitate that question answering. And again, so much of it comes down to, and something that we've really had to think about this year as some of the extra staffing we've had ended, was that many times, it's okay if you don't have the answer, if you tell somebody you saw their question. And folks are, especially now, just looking for that human connection, and it makes a world of a difference. Like I said before, we have more than 50% of question askers opting in to get our newsletters. And so from that work alone, we added more than 3,800 people to our email list. One other thing I want to say before I move off of the question answering is that it taught us a lot about how we work together too. I mean, I think it was an opportunity for us to be extremely collaborative, but also to understand that this is not only trauma facing, but trauma negotiating work. Something that my team and I have developed, and that I have to, as a manager, say aloud and say often, is the minute you, not only when you hit the wall, but the minute you see that wall in your future, raise your hand and tap out, no questions asked. We are, I think, a pretty empathetic group. We're also a pretty diverse group. And there have been a lot of things that folks have experienced in this year, and just wanting to make sure that we're recognizing and honoring that. With the question answering, because we were paying attention, we were able to identify stories maybe sooner than we would have otherwise. One of the first questions, I always talk about like the questions that felt like a punch to the gut, but one of those early questions for us last year was of a gentleman who wrote in and said, "My father died and my siblings and I want to know whether it's illegal for us to gather to bury him." And it was one of those moments where the questions were turning from curiosity and concern to really palpable fear and hurt. And we were able to start telling those stories sooner than we would have otherwise. We also, of course, heard folks saying, my daughter's wedding is coming. Do I cancel it? What do we do? And what we really saw was a lot of questions about unemployment. There were 2 different times in 2020 when we had about 10 questions coming in a minute. And they were all people trying to deal with California's unemployment system. And so that was an opportunity for us to go from, I think journalists were really quick to self-identify as essential last year, but not necessarily to recognize, that might be a disservice to say that. But I think, I think this was an opportunity for us to prove ourselves essential, right? And to really start to meet an information need. But it wasn't all sad. Last year, we also launched a TikTok. And what I love about this, it was a news apprentice on our team who really had passion about this. And so we've been able to start with videos about the election, discovered that one member of our team is an incredible cake decorator. And so we had a whole series of, is it a cake or is it a ballot? It was always a cake. And to bring in more staff. I think one of the things that happens is when you're trying to get buy-in for engagement, so often you're selling something, you're selling something to folks that they've never experienced. So the more that we can have people experience it in our everyday, the easier it is to get that buy-in. We also, we text, like I said, we have that weekly early childhood text. We have a breaking news text that we do. And we were able to leverage the service we use, which is called Ground Source, to also launch a call-in line that parents could use. Last year, it was still going. And I think we're actually closer to 20,000 now, to hear Oscar the Grouch and Grover talk about the importance of staying home. I'm always sort of laughing though, because I think at least 1,000 of those are my boss calling. We have virtual and live events. We have just a wonderful team that runs this, and we've been able to, especially in the last several months, work on building more accessibility into our events. So we're hiring interpreters and doing live transcription and thinking about how we can invite more folks in. We also, because of the engagement work we've done, we were able to pivot last summer very quickly and invite people to look back at stories we'd already told and have conversations about systemic racism, systemic issues that we're experiencing in a place where it didn't feel like we were just discovering that these things are real. Collaboration, I mentioned community, ethnic, and language media in LA. There are more than 100 organizations that would be classified this way. The woman on the far left is now at Solutions Journalism Network, Michelle Faust-Ragavan. But this was something that we really came to in our census research, of saying, we want to make sure that we're reaching and serving audiences that we haven't necessarily done a great job of, and those audiences that have traditionally been undercounted in the census. What was really critical, to borrow a little language from the census itself, was the recognition that in so many of these communities, we are not the trusted messengers. And we are not quickly going to become the trusted messengers. But if we can think about what co-designing a meaningful collaboration would look like, then it's something that we could do, building equity into the process. I will say, because of some staffing issues, this has not been the most successful thing that we've done, because it's just, if you're, and I think that folks on this call will know this, if you're in a smaller organization, you're fielding a lot and you have needs that just have to be met. So while we can call another public radio station and assume that our phone call or email will be responded to quickly, if you're trying to work with a smaller organization, that's just not always possible, because they're doing so much. And so, we're trying to always figure out more ways that we can support this work. I wanted to just quickly shout out some members of our team, because it is a team. For a long time, I was the entire team, and now I get to work with these fine folks every day. I mentioned incredible cake decorating. That would be Caitlin Biljean. Stephanie and Brianna Lee, or Stephanie Top and Brianna Lee, there are two beat-specific engagement producers, and so they're really working to support early childhood and our college pathways beat with everybody. While they might have a specific focus, they are working across the organization and really helping each other build more skills. Perry Walland is the news apprentice who started our TikTok. She is also a cat whisperer and has most recently specialized in seed distribution. She had a day last week that I'm waiting for her to do a Twitter thread, because in one day she was buying wheat flour to do wheat pasting on walls, because we have a project coming up where we're doing outdoor installation of photos. So she was doing that, but she was also at a farm playing with goats, and this was all just her, this was her work day. And so it was fun. And then Zoe is the newest member of our team, and she's really been working to pick up all the skills and the tools and the general approach. Speaking of tools, these are some of the ones that we go to most regularly. We work with Hearken, which has an embed. It's what you saw in that mission statement, in order to invite and answer questions. The Public Insight Network is mostly defunct at this point, but it's really been something that's driven a lot of our approach when it comes to sourcing and source management. With sourcing, we use Typeform to build surveys. Video Ask is a sister operation of Typeform and allows us to do, just as you might assume, that work, but with video. And then Ground Source is a tool that we use for texting and for calls. With all of these, there are free versions of it. I would just make a point of saying, knowing what your state's and your organization's requirements are when it comes to privacy and information management, and that probably will determine more than anything the decisions that you use. And I think that is it. I wanted to make sure that there was some time for questions.
Yes, that was incredible, Ashley. Thank you so much. So many ideas that we can all take away from that. And yes, of course, there are questions. I think you touched on this a little bit, but Natalie, did you want to follow up on your question?
Yeah, so hi Ashley, Natalie Van Hooser here. So related to a lot of the great work that your team has done with the in-person tabling and engagement events, the big question that always comes up now with the pandemic is how has that changed or evolved during the pandemic? Have you been focusing on trying to maintain those audiences? Have you expanded into other ones? And what does everything look like now going forward as different types of in-person functions are starting back up again?
It's a really good question. And a lot of what we did just came to complete standstill, as you might imagine, last year. Our events team was able to really quickly pivot to doing virtual events. And they've done a lot of experimentation in the last year, looking at how do we make things more accessible? How do we make sure that we're doing the necessary data capture, but also not preventing people from being able or wanting to interact? Something that was kind of surprising, we're in constant conversation with organizations that are in service to community members. And one of the things that folks were telling us was that in a lot of their events, the participation was actually up because Zoom and other platforms made things more accessible. And so that's something that's definitely played out in a lot of our engagement work. When we've done, we've moved Feeding the Conversation to Zoom. We've taken full advantage of the breakout room functions. And that's been really great. One thing that I was joking yesterday, I was saying, like, regardless of what you're researching, I have a very strong suspicion that every time the findings will be, you should work with your library more. And so really paying attention to what your local libraries are doing, how they're reopening, what kind of opportunities there are there. So we still work with, oh, I just saw Anne's on here. Hi, Anne. But we work with our local libraries to think about how we can distribute through them if there are opportunities, if there are ever opportunities to get onto their websites, because in so many ways they are the social services that people turn to most. We also, I love the way that our different beats speak to and inform each other. And so building off of that for our most recent College Pathways event, which was entirely designed around community members' questions, we started working with the YMCA. And so thinking about how they can partner. And when you look at our early childhood coverage, something that I love about that is this is still technically like a niche audience that we're cultivating, right? Parents and caregivers of children 0 to 5 in LA County. LA County is huge, so it's still a big number. But the thing that I can tell you without any fear of overstating it is that reporter producer team has like complete penetration of the target audience. People know Mariana's name. People know what she's doing. And when you look at other journalists who are in the field, like they know Mariana's name and they're saying like, well, we designed this based on what she's doing. So that's been great. One other thing that I'll point out, I mentioned wheat pasting, which I just really love because I think, I went to an international high school program and we did a lot of coloring. And so it's kind of that thing of like, kids are like, well, I'm never going to use this math. And you're like, yes, you will. I really did not think I would use my coloring as an adult. And yet it has come up so many times. For a long time, I thought the thing I'd be best known for was that I designed a coloring book. But like the arts part of it, like bringing people in and finding ways to be creative. And I, by the way, am a terrible artist, but like that's continued to be a through line in engagement. There was a really great CJR article yesterday about the ways in which engagement and creativity has come into distribution. But I bring all of that up in a very long-winded way because for this year 2 of a participatory photo project we're doing, we are doing outdoor installations. So we've been working with a dozen caregivers and childcare providers to document their lives through photography. They've got training and cameras from us, and then they've just been at it. And so what we're doing is that around in Orange County, in LA County and in the Antelope Valley, you're going to see giant photos from them. And so that'll be fun too, because you're just, like LA is such a driving space, and that's how you're going to be able to see what they're up to.
Actually, I actually have a question too.
Go for it.
Yeah. So yeah, Mark, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and I think a lot about audience engagement and sort of, how did I want to ask this? I think we're like, journalists are operating in an age where there's almost more audience engagement than ever, and to the point where our audience has a potential say in whether or not we keep our jobs, whether or not we make bad editorial decisions. Like you mentioned, the sort of, I guess, I think you were hinting at a potential tasteless mentioning of Happy Cinco de Mayo. I don't know what you're mentioning, but I think we operate in an age where maybe too much audience involvement in our work could spell the end of our jobs. And I'm wondering, sort of, how would you approach that, answer that question? Is like, how much audience involvement in our editorial insight and our decisions is necessary, and where do you draw the line?
So I'd start by saying that I make a pretty, I didn't say it before, but I make a distinction between audience engagement and community engagement. I think with audience engagement, first of all, that's often code for social media, which is part of community engagement too, but it's not the limit of it. It often means going back and super serving the same group of folks. Within community engagement, I feel some more aspiration there. I feel an opportunity to go outside of our traditional audiences and to start to earn the trust and support of audiences that we haven't served before. And so while I think you're not the only person to name concerns about sort of that power sharing and how that could inform your work, just as much that if we are not doing community engagement, if we are not building new audiences and serving them and becoming indispensable to them, we don't have a financial future anyway. And so it's really thinking about how do we become relevant to the communities that can support us in the future so that we do have jobs. I was looking at the demographics of a newsroom recently because they were mapping what their audience currently looks like and what the changing demographics are of the community where they are. And their readership is quite literally dying. So unless they create a more inclusive space within their work, then they don't, it's just, there's no sustainability there. When it comes to power sharing, I think it's problematic that we've, as journalists, made so many decisions. We've decided what was important, and we've signaled it, because then we've completely missed stories. When we did our research on the census, for example, we were feeling great coming out of our early childhood research because our research had borne out that we were doing a fantastic job. We had gotten folks more aware of the connection between early childhood education and long-term outcomes with health, education, career. When it came to the census, unless we had done that work, we would not have had the understanding that we were completely failing at connecting people or helping people connect the dots between the census and their everyday lives. And so it is, in so many ways, that kind of engagement is an opportunity for us to identify our blind spots, to build new audiences, to come up with stories that we wouldn't have known were compelling or necessary to tell before. It does not mean that you're turning over your editorial standards. It does not mean that you no longer have a say in what you're producing, but it does mean that that there's an opportunity to fulfill your role in being a trusted messenger in the communities you're trying to serve.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. I think it's, yeah, our role is to tap into the almost hive mind, and that's, yeah, okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I always like getting onto a soapbox.
Well, you have it. You certainly have it. The Zoom box.
The Zoom box.
It sounds like an instrument. Anyway.
If you haven't, I will say I was talking to somebody at WBEZ yesterday, and if you haven't done this already, one of the things that we found super helpful in our team, because we have folks that we've hired during the pandemic, we went around one day in one of our team meetings, and our check-in question was just asking each other how tall we were. Because it's this realization that we have no idea. A number of us have never seen each other in person. And it's just like these things like, okay, like how do we make sure that we're not just a Zoom box for each other? As you can see, I bring my whole family to every Zoom call.
That's amazing. Ashley, I know you have a hard leave soon, or I think we might have time maybe for one more question. Is there anyone else who wants to raise a question? I'm happy to do it if nobody else wants to, but I know that among this bunch, there are some great, creative, curious minds. No? Okay, then I'll ask. Ashley, I just want to say I so appreciated at the beginning how, and just now again, you've kind of reiterated what you mean by engagement. I am so guilty of saying that word and, not like fully grasping what it means. I guess my question would be, what is like the biggest mistake that you see other newsrooms make, or your own newsroom has made under the guise of engagement that has actually caused more harm than good, if there are any?
That's a great question. I want to, because I don't know how to make it look like this in Zoom. I want to make sure to tell Anne that it's 5'6.5". That half inch, because I was supposed to be 6 feet tall and I'm just not that. So a couple things. One, I think, is not having a sense of what engagement is, not creating shared language. Where you put engagement in your organization. So just at a technical level, where, what's the reporting line? Do they report to marketing, or do they report up to through the journalism team? That's really critical. The kind of issue, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, and so I'll go to our team, our organization. We did one event, I mentioned it before, that there was something that had gone wrong. We did a conversation, and we were asking folks to talk about hate crimes. And we hired an outside facilitator, and we were in conversation, and that facilitator just wasn't listening. He wasn't picking up the cues that people were feeling like it was an extractive conversation, that people needed, in facilitation, we talk about creating a container. That container hadn't been created. People were not supported. And it ended up, we were able to salvage it. I mean, sort of in real time, asked him to sit down, and I stepped into it. And we made it something that was really participatory, that was driven by the needs in the room. But I think, the way that I sometimes think about it, and this might be oversimplifying it, but like if you drop a fork on your foot, it's going to hurt. If you cut somebody open and they are on the table because they are so raw and exposed because of the asks that you've made through your engagement work, and you drop a fork on them, it's catastrophic. And so understanding that when we move from those transactional call outs to something that is more relational, that there's a vulnerability that we're inviting that we might not have the awareness of. Also, just generally recognizing the power dynamics. If you're a media organization, people are going to answer you, especially if it's somebody, and Christina, who I'd mentioned, she and I have had this conversation. Like, she's never going to say no to us because she sees us as really critical to supporting her career. So we have to understand that there's this power dynamic at play, and be informed by that in our communications. I hope that answers it.
Yes, That is so powerful. I don't think anyone's ever going to get that fork image out of their head. It's so in a great way, really. Thank you. Ashley, thank you so much. Really, there's a reason why you are the household name that you are at
Oh.
SGSN. We just continue to be so blown away by your thoughtfulness and great ideas. And I know that lots of folks on this call are excited to dig into them more. So yes, we'll be sending out this presentation and the recording. And Ashley, thank you so much again. I really appreciate your
course.
time.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody, and congrats for all the work you're doing. Bye.
Fork imagery right before lunch. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much also to those of you who reached out. It's super, super kind. Some of you, the community cohort, I'll be seeing you later today. And others, I'll be seeing you tomorrow, Friday, next week. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.